Well, yes, we haven't gone beyond. We have lots of ways of.
And the fact is that it's not just imposed or done on criminals, but like with things like surveillance, it's like everybody is undermined or
Right.
oppressed by this presence
Right.
of force.
Right. But the thing about a camera is that theoretically it's supposed to be objective. In the earlier, in the older way of thinking, society was maintained by continual by displaying again and again symbols that represented the mixing of what is the case and our feelings about it, as representative of a kind of underlying support or ground on which everything rested. In a way, it's like that in the modern world, things are supposed to rest on something objective. In the end, we might bring out sets of statistics. It's the last resort as to what objective reality is. Whereas in older societies, the ground on which everything rests on was not an objective one. It was a mixture of objective and subjective, with very little ability to separate the two. So it's like if in Tudor England, if someone, if you attended a public execution in which something utterly, dismemberment of the body, the fact of the dismemberment was a proof that of guilt. It was kind of it's back to front, but the presentation of someone in a degraded state was meant to be read as something symbolic.
Is there any similarity between that and human sacrifice?
Oh well.
I mean, I know it's like much
Yes.
further on, but it's
Yes.
just wondering.
Well, in fact, sacrifice. Well, there's. Jordan Peterson has things to say about sacrifice. In a way, a kind of moral interpretation of it. Originally, of course, it was literal, but it's been we've been able to move away from the literal practice of sacrifice to a symbolic form. But there's a continuity of pattern going through human history. So, in this way of interpreting, what sacrifice was about, doesn't seem like the Aztecs did not sacrifice human beings in order to make the sun rise, as you might, that might be our modern interpretation. But they did it, to kind of maintain the cycle. I mean, in a way, that's a kind of we explain things in that way because we assume that myth is a primitive form of science and it's an attempt to deal with the natural world. In this way of looking at it, the explanation is that it's an attempt, a first attempt, to deal with the moral world, and that when Aztecs practiced human sacrifice, as many ancient peoples did, in fact they had a tendency, and even when it was largely abandoned, many peoples went back to it at a time of crisis. It's a way of dealing with the moral world in the way that it lays itself out for human beings. So what I mean by that is that, well, for most of human history, life has been extremely hard and difficult, extremely painful, without much let up. So that in order to live at all, for most of human history, human beings have had to find a way of confronting, facing up, holding, turning towards pain and suffering, not to hide away from it, not for pain and suffering to be something that is just that can't be faced, that is extreme pain, extreme suffering had to be brought into the range of things that it's bearable to consider. So what that meant is that when someone turned towards suffering or endured suffering with courage and faced it and allowed themselves to experience it, then that was seen as well, something to imitate. Someone who did that became a model for others. And as happens very quickly in traditional culture, where someone does something that is notable, praiseworthy, it very quickly becomes an idealized story, even within the lifetime of the person who does it. So the story is repeated and recounted, but almost immediately people forget about the facts, and they tell an idealized picture, which is almost like keeping only the essentials that are useful for survival, or kind of the sort of what is the essence of the story. So the person who willingly enters a difficult situation becomes the model for the the hero myth. To begin with, symbolically, probably to begin with actually, it meant actually death. In early forms of kingship, in the earliest forms of kingship, the king, after a year or after a period of time, would be ritually killed. I mean, that was changed. Kings changed it. To begin with, a substitute, somebody else, and then then an animal could be substitute for a human being, and then eventually even then in a way confession of faults became a substitute even for killing an animal. It kind of the sort of tendency as time goes by for maybe for the element of understanding to dominate the ritual. So rituals start in their, let's say, I'm imagining this, in their crude form, with someone just doing something. In a way, it's a very physical thing. Something goes wrong, and which means something's out of balance. So you pay it back by, spilling blood. It's physical. As time goes by, it's no longer necessary. That in fact, it's no longer necessary to actually execute anyone or to kill. It becomes sufficient to tell the story. That it becomes that the doing something in imagination takes the place of physically doing it. So the substitute for dying or giving one's life becomes in traditional cultures traditions of renunciation, of asceticism. I mean, it's in early cultures, the most admired figures are the people who give up things. They give up things as a training to enable them to face, what's fearful, what's difficult, what's threatening. I mean, in time, it becomes, it stops being religiously based and becomes a philosophy. So in Stoicism, you get people practice giving up things. In fact, they actually practice. It's not that they practice giving up one's physical possessions, one's house. It sort of moves on to that one trains oneself to give up one's attachment to one's possessions, or one's attachment to a view of oneself. The idea is it's actually, in a way, it's not that it's becoming softer and more diffuse. It's actually becoming more sharply focused as time goes by on the essence of what needs to be done. So even at the time when it was crudely physical, sacrifice was actually about understanding, shining a light on things. In that Babylonian creation myth, the god who becomes the leader of the gods and who has established order and saves the situation is a god whose emblems are all to do with seeing and understanding. He wears a crown made up of eyes. In Indian mythology, Yama, who's the god of the dead and the very first figure, well, his emblem is a mirror. And his mirror, he shows the mirror to the soul, and the mirror reflects back, accurately what's there.
Is this related to? I know Jordan Peterson talks about the idea of the creation of the future, like the future didn't exist for.
The ability, yes.
Yeah.
To make a sacrifice now.
Yeah. So like ancient people wouldn't have really had the ability to sacrifice much for the future because of the nature of the way they lived their life, perhaps compared to later people who were able to see more into the future and sacrifice more in that sense.
Well, people learnt to do it as soon as they invented agriculture. And again, this is an example, like in our modern accounts, we think of it as a practical utilitarian revolution, that people came up with a better way of living. Well, it was. Or at least it supported a larger population. But probably, given the way that the earlier peoples experienced things, they would never have thought of it themselves like that. They would have thought of it in terms of a story of precisely that kind, where you sacrifice the present for the sake of reaping a benefit in the future.
Sorry, which people are you talking about there?
Well, probably, I mean, the peoples who invented agriculture, probably in let's say, Middle Eastern tribes in the 8th millennium BC.
So the tribes that were sacrificing their king on a sort of annual basis or whatever, what sort of lifestyle were they living? Was that pre-agriculture? Or?
Well, that seems to have been, that would have been probably something of that kind was going on in the earliest city-states, where I mean, in the earliest levels of Sumerian civilization, you find tombs where the whole household, the whole king's household, has been walled up together. They all died, or were killed together. I mean, in a way, like the the Egyptians hit on the idea that you didn't actually have to do that. You could make little wooden models of all the people that you wanted to take with you, and you put that in the tomb. You don't go, So human beings are very ingenious. They're very inventive. They don't have to go on and on hitting themselves on the head with a hammer. They find substitutes. I mean, yes.
But these would have been admirable people in their society. The king would have had embodied these qualities that you talked about of being, of being in awe of them. People would have seen them as role models, possibly. But yet they were entering into this voluntarily, I guess. This very odd, from our perspective, lifestyle, where they're going to live for this short period as a king, and then they're going to die. So.
Right.
So were these people admired by their by their citizens, and was
Well,
it something that was
it's
seen
not.
as...
It's not admiration as we think of. I mean, they weren't it's not like celebrity admiration. Probably in the ancient world, for someone to be admirable meant that what you saw, what you were in contact with when you were in contact with them, or when they were appearing with their symbolic regalia, or, when they were in their king function, was the archetype, or which is something non-personal, which the person that you're with was the symbol of. So it's like there was this sort of ground on which everything society rested, which was impersonal forces thought of and represented as gods, which would surface as visible symbols in the form of the key the key figures of the society. In a sense, because the supporting ground of the world being full of gods, and the person who was a king or the priest or whatever they were, I mean, being very easily seen as a symbol, or as a god, without cease, in a sense, in their function, probably facilitated the separation of actually, killing someone. In a sense, because it was symbolic to begin with, symbolic substitutes could easily be added in. So once as you're already living in a symbolic world, you've got facility. You've got the option of doing things with the symbols.
So what would motivate somebody to take that role? I mean, assuming that was a voluntary choice. I mean, if you could live as a king for a year and then be killed, it doesn't seem like a great deal,
As a career option.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, why did people choose to have a career being fired out of cannons? Why do people make a career out of going into lion cages with just a whip and a chair? I mean, or why climb mountains where with the probability sooner or later you're going to fall, and even people who do fall, it doesn't seem to put them off. They go, if they can still walk, they'll go straight back and do it again. I mean, we're not as rational as all that. And putting it that way, it's not a great deal. All right, you get to drink as much wine as you want for a year, and then you get killed. I mean, or it may not be. I mean, put like that, it's not so great. The thing is that human beings also think symbolically. I mean, even modern human beings. I mean, we train ourselves in key situations not to think symbolically. To think, well, we call it rationally, systematically, analytically, carefully separating our feelings from, the objective situation. And it's a good thing that we do that, and we have that ability. I mean, it saves lives. The thing is that the symbolic way of thinking hasn't gone away. In some way,
Yeah, I was just thinking that when you said because everything was symbolic anyway,
I was thinking about yes, back then. But a little
that
bit of
doesn't
practical.
quite make sense, because if you thought, you wouldn't think that things were symbols, you would think that they were real. Everything was on that level
Oh,
of...
well.
It's only
Yes.
sort of, is it not a development that you begin to think of things as symbolic?
Well,
Do you see what I mean? I'm trying to get my head
possibly
around.
not. You see, that's. I mean, how does a small child talk about or think about the things that they're interacting with? They
It takes quite a long time for them to realise that things aren't real. Like an
Right.
animated dinosaur that very intelligent 6-year-old is still hanging on to the idea that it really was a dinosaur.
right.
The
The thing that
it takes a while, doesn't it?
yes, but what's taking a while is that there's that for children below a certain age, there's a way of responding to the world that is available and meaningful, which works without making a distinction without making distinctions that we make as adults. So distinction between inner and outer, things that talk, things that can't talk, things that are animate, things that are not animate. It's not as though that people who think in that way are not thinking, now I'm using a symbol. We can think of symbols, we can have the idea and concept of a symbol because we can make that distinction. But what I'm talking about is going back to a time and a state of mind where you don't yet have the option of making a distinction, that you don't have the option, at least conceptually, of separating a person from their function.
Well, that's what I understood you to mean. So in fact, you said that for them everything was symbolic, but in a way nothing was symbolic.
Oh, well, yeah. If everything's symbolic, nothing's symbolic.
You can only
If
have
everything's a
symbol if
god,
you have
nothing's
the
a god. Yeah.
separation, no? You see what I mean? Anyway.
Well, yes. Well, the word symbol. I mean, the word symbol has an interesting etymology, and there's a story behind the word symbol. It comes from a Greek word, or two Greek words, meaning to throw together. So, and according to one story of the origin of the first symbol, Hephaestus, Vulcan, was working in his workshop, and apparently something broke in two, and he discarded it and threw it down. and Apollo or Hermes or kind of saw this object in two halves and sort of picked it up and kind of saw that the two halves fitted together and thought, this is quite interesting. I'll make a civilization out of this. So that's the kind of the physical action of two things that reveal that they are one thing because they fit into each other. So a symbol in the ancient world functioned like a ticket or a tally stick. It's like two people who made an agreement or a bargain would break something in two, and one person would go off, and the other person would go off. And the evidence of the agreement was in that the two pieces fitted together. So the idea of the symbol is that are two things that seem separate, but are actually, you put them together and they're one thing. So, in fact, in the terminology of the Roman Catholic Church, the Eucharist, the wafer, is called a symbolon, from the original Greek word symbol, because it has an analogous function. So in that symbol, two things that are separate are brought together, become one thing. That is heaven and earth, the visible and the invisible. In a way, it's like a symbol represents all opposites coming together.
I was just sort of thinking of an example of a sacrifice that came to my head when we were talking about that a minute ago. And I'd read about this idea of going to Mars, the first trips to Mars.
Right, yes.
So they're looking for volunteers to go on this initial trips,
Right.
And the idea is you're not going to come back. You're going to you're going to try and establish a civilization,
Right.
and not come back. And I thought, well, these people are sort of sacrificing themselves because they know they're never going to come back to Earth. But they're doing it for a greater good, for the furthering of of human frontiers or whatever.
Yes.
But they're going to die or what. So it's a similar time frame even. Like they might die in 1 or 2 years or whatever. But is that a symbolic? Is that a symbol? Is that a symbolic act?
Well, it probably becomes symbolic. I mean, in fact, you read science fiction, and if you know about them, you can see it's full of the symbols in ancient mythology, even though the authors probably weren't aware. And the mythological themes resurface in fiction. And in fact, because we have the capacity to understand symbols, to use symbols, and to think symbolically, we can enjoy fiction. We understand what's happening in a fiction without needing to understand or think about it. So, going to Mars. Well, I mean that fits in with the symbolic pattern of the hero who goes to another world, that crosses a boundary. And I mean, whether or not this, when in fact it seems to be often the case in science fiction, that people kind of leave Earth and go travelling among planets in order to encounter a highly symbolic world, and a world in which passionate feelings and objects are not separable at all. You know, that you can have it makes perfect sense to have a satanic villain who's really an amoeba, but shows himself in human form, who captures vulnerable maidens, you know, and has to be rescued by sort of intrepid spacemen who actually, I mean, as often happens in these stories, the satanic evil figure has unparalleled force. He wins because he has superior power. But the hero of the story wins in the end because they have understanding. So, you know, just as Marduk in the Babylonian myth wins the battle against the monsters because he's crowned with eyes that can see. So in one science fiction story that I read, the classic evil figure who is an amoeba in human form, who managed to get his hands on a very nice, sympathetic, blonde 19-year-old girl, you know, as you know, in outer space. The hero overcomes this incredible power because he's really a god, actually. You know, and he's 2,000 million years old and all the rest of it. But I mean, in a sense, they win because they have these futuristic devices that are like eyes that can travel anywhere. So he can see everything that's going on in the spaceship, and it can kind of speak in people's minds like their conscience. And you know, all these classic things, and so this immense power is defeated because someone by light, you know, by let there be light.
I think I'll have to get some of the authors down, note them down with these books you're talking about. Very interesting. How do we have the eyes then? What do we do?
Well, we're finding the eyes. Well, sacrifice. You know, the old idea of the sacrifice. You see, that's the thing. You get the eyes by the right kind of renunciation. Again, in a way, seeing the future, or seeing that in a way you see beyond the present. You see beyond what's immediately apparent. I mean, thinking mythologically, probably in the language of religions, you see reality, a metaphor and a symbol. That's all. You penetrate to a reality that's not obvious, and you get that power to see by practice, by a renunciation.
If you were to live out this myth, as a society,
Yeah.
would you not? To me, it just sounds like you develop objective science, right? That's kind of. I mean, that's you
Right.
renounce your preferences and how you'd like the world to be, and interference in the world, and become an observer. And that's how you shine the light on things. And
Well, I mean, this line of argument, which I'm getting from Jordan Peterson, we took it from Piaget, and is arguing that the objective science is actually as a career or as an experience is a modern form of an ancient myth.
Are there not some parts of science that are maybe more mythological and some that aren't? So let's say, for instance, physics, which has the Big Bang as the one of the models is the
really
big
mythological.
yeah the Big
I
Bang.
mean,
is
it was actually a Roman Catholic priest who first came up with that idea, the Big Bang.
Yeah, so you've got something like that, the Big Bang, which
Yeah.
is, and then you've got something maybe more like mathematics, just like sort of pure mathematics,
Well,
yes.
yes.
would seem that seems
that's absolute truth.
Well,
seems to have a
yes.
foundation. Yeah.
I mean,
Right.
the
You-
thing,
It's
you don't-
completely mythological.
yeah.
Like 2 + 2 or a triangle or something. There's just a reality there. It's not, that's the foundation. isn't it?
Well, yes. I mean, yes. Well, all right. Maybe it is a reality there, but there's something mysteriously, uniquely human that's going on, where we are able to understand and deal with objects that don't have any physical or not dependent upon a physical manifestation. I mean, we get pretty easily from counting our building blocks. I mean, some to an abstract conception of numbers as being as disembodied entities that are kind of present in all sorts of things, but you can't actually see or touch them, but they're there. I mean, in fact, when Pythagoras, Pythagoras, the pre-Socratic philosophers, developed his idea that everything's made, the universe is made up of numbers, everything's numbers. He was living at a time when, he was very close to people who were saying that the world, everything is made up of gods, and the world is full of gods. And probably, back then, to say that everything is made up of numbers is not unlike saying everything is made up of gods. I mean, but
Numbers are gods. That's the.
all right. Okay. Yes, they are gods. Yes.
In a sense, I mean, they're good and pure and beautiful, and they control everything. I mean,
Yes.
what do you want?
Well, gods aren't so good and pure. So in that way, they're better than the numbers are better than gods. They're purer than gods. Okay. So, maybe time for another story. Here's another myth of origins. Jordan Peterson sort of recounts it in his own way. He kind of thinks that as a kind of step beyond the Babylonian myth, being more sophisticated in some way. But it's the myth of Osiris. So Osiris was a legendary king, was very wise and good. But he didn't have a very good understanding of people. For always being wise and good, or at least certain of a key person, and that it was his brother Seth. And Osiris, maybe because he was so good, had no conception of just what an evil person his brother Seth was. And so he was taken by surprise, and Seth cut him up, cut him into pieces, and distributed the various parts of his body all over Egypt. And that might have been the end of the story. Seth inherits the earth. But it's not. Because Osiris had a wife who had great magical power, called Isis, who was able to perform the feat of having sexual union with him when he was still in pieces, and conceiving a child and giving birth to the child Horus. At some point, the pieces get put back together again, but he's still dead. He's down in the underworld, in a quite a sorry state, not able, a kind of lethargic, incapable state. But Horus is his son, is very capable, and he tackles Seth, the evil brother, and kills him, and reestablishes the kingdom in Egypt, reestablishes law and order, almost like Osiris. But Horus had a difficult victory, and maybe he may have been chastened by the struggle, because in the course of the struggle with Seth managed to strike out and capture one of his eyes. Horus managed to get his eye back again, but instead of putting it back in his head, he decides that the better thing to do with it is to take it down to the underworld and give it to his father, for it to be the eye that he never had and needed. And so he goes down to the underworld. He gives to Osiris his other eye, who revives, and they come back and they restore the kingdom of Egypt, and bring it to a level that it had never achieved, in a way to sort of take things further. So you got this theme of eyes this is kind of is a feature of these myths that its eyes people are battling over. In a way, in mythological terms, there's a struggle to see. I mean, if you look at in Buddhism, you have the idea of moha, delusion, which is the state where, partly at our own connivance, partly we can't help it, but we are not as aware as we could be. If anything is a primal fault, kind of original sin. No, there is an original sin, but something, the thing that is the problem, the fundamental problem behind all the other problems that needs addressing, is this human difficulty of closing our eyes to things which we could see. We turn a blind eye, as we say. We choose not to see. And in the Osiris Horus myth, the whole issue of eyes and of something going on that one should see, one ought to see, but one doesn't see, is the point of the story. So, we tell stories often to warn people about the danger of not seeing what's there, in a way of kind of being hypnotized by the obvious, that we don't see what's hidden. So one of the reasons why, for so much of human history, and even still being the case, that we are dependent upon stories, fiction, symbolic language, is that it's still the way that we warn ourselves of the danger, the real peril of not seeing what's in front of us. And thinking about the great stories, the really great stories, the ones that are always retold, continue to be read with pleasure, and that stay meaningful. Probably what they have in common is that they're a story about the dangers of misperception and failing to see, of almost willful blindness, as opposed to a hero or heroine that has the courage to see what everybody else is ignoring or choosing not to see. And that stories are still the best way to convey that. In a sense that is why human beings, for most of their history, have had a lot of time for invisible beings who don't exist. I mean, looking at it in a rational sort of sense, we have human beings that spend a remarkable amount of time, and still do, with imaginary people who don't exist. In fact, it's probably what what we do with our leisure time. Or at least, I mean, even if we do things with other people who do exist, we usually get together with other people to spend some time with our favourite imaginary people who don't exist and share the experience. It's I mean, why does it still fascinate us? It's kind of, I think it's because these fictions, these stories, these imaginary people are kind of standing in for, they remind us, they put us in touch of the experience of seeing what isn't there, and seeing what is there, and not seeing what isn't there. In a way that they form the exemplars of it. Does anyone got any immediate objection to what I've just said? Because that would be quite helpful to me.
There are opposite myths, aren't there, like Cassandra or the boy who cried wolf,
Right,
wherein
well, you know what happened to Troy because of that, and that's the point of the story. I mean, there is a story told by Kipling about the man who wandered into the land of the blind. Everyone in this country was blind, and he could see. And he tries to explain to them what it is to see. And I mean, it's a little bit, and they think he's crazy, and they think he's mentally ill, and they think that the problem with him is he's got these two things in his head that are making all this making him ill. So they get hold of him, and they put out his eyes so he's blind like everybody else. All right, well that's
for his own good, presumably.
For his own good, yes. I mean, the point of the story is our immediate response to the awfulness of it. Just as we have an emotional response to Plato's myth of the cave, which has probably inspired the story, where in the myth of the cave, the people who've grown up in the cave and only see shadows, and someone, the images of things, someone gets a chance to leave the cave and sees things in the light of the sun and sees kind of reality, quote unquote, and comes back and tries to tell them, and they get extremely angry, and I think they beat him up, or in the original telling, it's quite drastic.
So is there any connection between this and sacrifice? The idea that the king rules for a year, and presumably wisely so has to see reality and stuff.
Right.
And then I mean, one version of events would be that the Cassandras of this world who see the awful truth and announce it, are going to get killed anyway because nobody wants to be ejected from Eden, right? Nobody wants to hear the awful truth.
Prophets, yes.
And then post hoc, you sort of make up the story that kind of that was how it had to be because of the theory of sacrifice.
Oh, right. Well, the thing, the sacrifice is. It doesn't have to be that you kill someone or kill something. the sacrifice. I mean, you could sacrifice an idea, or an assumption, or a way of seeing things. The underlying idea is that you make the decision to face, well, in some ways that symbolically, in some form, you go back to the original chaos. I don't know if that if you understand what I mean by that. Well, basically that let's say that you're there's a group of people, or society, or an individual, where everything seems quite well ordered. You know, the rich man, as the hymn says, you know, the rich man in his palace and the poor man in his hovel, you know, shone on by the beneficent sun. That sees that everybody knows their place in society, you know, a well-ordered society, as it should be. Supposing, or that things are, you know, or that the axioms of Euclid are eternal and unchanging in our reality, and there's no other way of thinking. You can't. What does it take to step? Well, what persuades people to step beyond, you know, the idea that this is how it is? And what happens? You know, I mean, usually it's that people set things up in a certain way, and increasingly there are anomalies, there are problems with it. It becomes sterile, it's not working. There's too many things that don't fit. And anyway, things that lie outside the box, as we say, are becoming much more interesting and fascinating and possibly fruitful and fertile. And people want to go off and explore it. So at a certain point in a culture or in someone's life, or something happens where the order that everyone kind of believed in, you let go, it sort of collapses, or it gets thrown into the melting pot, and then there's this period where you just don't know, kind of, there's nothing. Well, that's an image of sacrifice. In fact, it was actually in ancient Babylon. In fact, that's it's the origin of Christmas, actually, believe it or not. Christmas and New Year, because the Babylonians had this 10-day festive, 12-day festival at the end of the year, which was a kind of chaos period, a period of where the usual order collapsed, or symbolically, and in a way the new order had to be set up. You know, the people, there were sort of rituals and ceremonies to make it possible for the new year to start again. And symbolically, that involved sacrifice. I mean, they stopped killing. They stopped killing the king at that point. And in fact, just told story. You know, they told the story of the instead. but the thing is that it was built into the year, a period of chaos that passed into Christian Europe as the Feast of Fools and Twelfth Night and you know, mayhem at Christmas, which is like a sort of afterglow, a sort of survival of the periodic need to revive chaos in order to start the year again.
How do people sustain themselves during this chaos?
It also, that's kind of, isn't there a sense in which this gets played out beforehand in sacrificing the individual? The individual who's pointed out the flaws in the way you're doing things.
Right.
This tends to happen kind of in reality and stuff. You know, people like Copernicus or Semmelweis, the guy who told doctors to wash their hands and stuff, do tend to end up in lunatic asylums or prison, executed, whatever. I mean, Copernicus didn't, but only because he waited till he was 70 years old before he published, right? Because it was nobody's fault. And so the connection between sort of kind of interesting is the connection between the fact that the person who does shine the light kind of needs to suffer for it because we're going to suffer.
We tell stories about exemplary heroes who are willing to do that. You know, in the modern world, we have the heroes of thought, the heroes of science, who, you know, like Galileo, who gets imprisoned because he dares to say the Earth goes around the sun. You know, that we need to tell stories where someone wins over brute force because they've got a better eye and sees better. We always uphold and support stories where the person who sees more clearly triumphs over the person who has more force at their disposal.
I'm just thinking as well about the collective, you know, because like with these festivals of sacrifice. So, well, I've got like a thought, you know, that in this time of sacrifice, that it's this coming together. Maybe the music, the festivities were a way of traversing that period, that uncomfortable period, and coming through it. Would that be right to think that?
Well, we give people the experience of it. I mean, in different ages, it's described in different ways. It's in ways that are appropriate and comprehensible. But probably at every stage of human history, right from the very beginning to modern times, there's some way in which we tell people that it's all right. A little bit of chaos, a little bit of you know, feel the fear and do it anyway. That's, you know, from the latest up. That we keep encouraging people to experience it, to undergo it, and we may not even use. I mean, some of the message could even be contained in music. I mean, there's you take one of the things that makes Beethoven's Eroica Symphony such a powerful experience. I mean, it was certainly a powerful experience when people first heard it, is that it was a piece of music that led people kind of imaginatively through a world of sound where there's a descent into a kind of chaos with a final kind of coming out at the end. But the point is that Beethoven pushed it much longer. It went on for much more and much deeper and much darker than Haydn would have pushed it. You know, it's like, you know, like when you know, sort of people in the classical period wrote dissonant quartets, or in the early 19th century, they people started writing quite deliberately dissonant music, and people were willing to listen to the dissonance. In a way, it's another way of telling that story, that there are benefits in bearing with the landmarks going, you know, and in a way, like artistic forms. Very often, they have that. They have that structure where through the art form, you set up a kind of precinct, kind of sort of a set-off area in which you take an audience or the participants quite deep into an experience of chaos, and then you bring them back.
I read a thing once that's the origin of the term fever pitch. Is
Right.
that concert orchestras used to be tuned at a lower frequency, bel canto as they called it, so deeper thing, and for political reasons, the flow of history, whatever, the early 19th century, there's a lot of revolution in the air, and
Yes.
it's a chicken and egg question, but at the same time, concert pitch is gradually ratcheting up, getting slightly higher.
Yes.
And this is stirring people up, just having more music tuned at a slightly higher frequency.
Well, there is a people probably in the late 18th, early 19th. Well, I mean, generally, people are in the Western tradition. Generally, there's a kind of conspiracy by artists to habituate people, get them used to higher and higher degrees of chaos.
The other thing was that in France it's still illegal. There's actually on French
Right.
statute books,
Right.
there's a law preventing you from tuning an orchestra above, I think it's 425 hertz or something.
Right.
Because that's, it's a form of sedition.
Yeah.
People are listening to popular music these days, not concert music, and that. What's that tuned to? Maybe that's still carrying it on. I don't know.
I don't know.
Well, I mean, yes, and I mean, tradition. I mean, if you go to traditional societies that intended to kind of stay, that thought themselves as always being stable and following a kind of eternal rhythm. The notion of music is that the purpose of music is to tune into the pre-existent harmony, and you don't interfere. You don't. In fact, you're very careful not to innovate, or you innovate within set forms that don't change, because they are rooted. If you interfere and tamper too much, then the fabric of the world will fall apart.
So we're in very chaotic times now.
Well, yes and no, because it could be that in order to get the benefits of the kind of society in which we live in now, we've learned to tolerate degrees of dissonance that people couldn't have tolerated. I mean, you know, it might be as a hopeful.
We've got a more complex world, a sort of a safer, as you were saying earlier, and a more complex world.
Well, it's kind of that it's somehow the message seems to have got through, or we've been persuaded that it's okay if nothing is eternally unchanging. You know, that's actually okay. It won't, you know, the sky won't fall in. You know, it's sort of there doesn't have to be an unchanging order. I mean, in a way, this is unique. It's never been. You know,
Sounds very Buddhist as well.
Well, yes. Yes. Yeah, well, they were kind of waiting for their day, you know, when they'd come into their own. Okay, so it's time for my schedule finish. And hopefully we'll get some chaos this evening. Or some order.
No chaos.
Highly ordered. The fabric of the universe will not be disrupted by what will take place
Well, we'll
this
see.
evening.
We'll see.